All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Katie Roundtree, Director of Membership and Events at NCRC. I'm going to start by doing a little bit of housekeeping, just kind of the rules of the road here, and then we'll tee up this fabulous presentation. As always, this event is covered by NCRC's Code of Conduct. If you're not sure what that entails, you can go to ncrc.org/conduct. And we thank you all for creating a welcoming and warm, respectful environment on this call. I see many folks are going ahead and introducing themselves. Please continue to do that. We love to hear where folks are coming from and what your interest is in the topic. As you have questions, please put those in the Q&A box. Some of those might get answered during the presentation. And we'll also have ample time for facilitated Q&A at the end. Please do tag NCRC in social media about this event. Just a reminder that this event will be recorded and we'll send this around to all registrants afterwards. And just a little bit about NCRC. NCRC is a network of over 700 organizations dedicated to making a just economy a national priority and a local reality. We work with our members to close the racial and socioeconomic wealth and opportunity divides. We do that by organizing agreements between financial institutions and our members to increase lending, investments, and philanthropy in neighborhoods that need it. We advocate for policies that encourage the just use of capital. We hold institutions accountable for discrimination in financial services and housing. We empower entrepreneurs and community organizations with grants, loans, technical assistance, and training. We invest in and around low and moderate income neighborhoods to increase home ownership in partnership with community organizations and municipalities, as well as lenders, investors, and developers. We produce agenda-setting research like this one, and stories, and we convene events that bring together stakeholders to advance equitable solutions, including webinars like this, and including the Just Economy Conference taking place in April. So if you haven't registered for that event already, we would love to see you in person in DC in just a few short weeks. I do want to say a big thank you to our speakers. My colleague, Greg Wilson, Senior Organizer at NCRC, is going to tell you a little bit more about each of those folks and about this really exciting report on redlining the reservation. So, Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. My name is Greg Wilson. I'm Senior Organizer for NCRC. And I want to welcome you again to NCRC's Redlining the Reservation webinar. As you may know, multiple staffers made this groundbreaking report and webinar possible, from our membership and communications teams to our organizing departments, and most of all, our research department. What you may not know is that the Redlining the Reservation report came about because of an idea offered up by an NCRC member, Native Community Capital's David Castillo. Dave's idea was simple. Banks keep telling us they don't have enough data to justify investing in Indian country. So he asked, what does the available data tell us about investment opportunities in Indian country? Our redlining report addresses that question and produced new literature that chronicles how the financial services industries are failing communities on and near tribal lands. Over the years, Dave has participated in community benefit agreements, Zoom meetings, coordinated by NCRC's organizing team. In brief, those are Zoom meetings where NCRC has organizations in a bank's footprint provide first-person testimonials to bank officials on ways their bank can improve its CRA performance. Dave has also been a panelist on breakout session at NCRC's annual conference last March, and he was a key resource for NCRC's Just Economy Regional Summit in Denver last September. When Dave met over Zoom with NCRC's research department a little over a year ago, it only took a few minutes for Jason Richardson and Bruce Mitchell to see a paper of this kind was an idea whose time had come. Redlining the Reservation is a collaboration of NCC, Native Community Capital, and NCRC. It's but a part, though, of a groundbreaking work applying research and data and investment opportunities in Indian country that's happening in other areas as well. Casey Lazar's team at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Center for Indian Country Development is the clearest example. Lazar and CICD staff have developed new research tools and convened data summits to define and tackle harmful data gaps regarding Indian country. NCRC is proud to be a part of this new era of applying research and data to spark new investments in and around tribal lands, and will continue to do so in 2024 and beyond. The NCRC research team of Jason Richardson, Bruce Mitchell, Jad Edley, and Joseph Dean produced this report. The team is a resource for all of you NCRC members. Feel free to contact us with any data or research-related questions. This is a benefit of NCRC membership, and we'll share this slide deck at the end of the presentation and before the Q&A. Take it away, Jason.
Greg, thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Bruce Mitchell, and I'm principal researcher with NCRC Research. And, you know, the title of this report, Redlining the Reservation, what are we talking about here? I mean, after all, federal examiners weren't dispatched to tribal areas to draw maps during the 1930s to indicate where mortgage lending risk was hazardous under the parlance of the time. No, instead, these maps were really drawn in a much earlier era, during the 19th century, and they consolidated this long process, which began with the Spanish and labor debt peonage, continued under the Americans with exploitation and dispossession of lands, so that these tribal areas, which were established and formalized during the 19th century, often in the most isolated and remote areas of the United States. These are areas that were largely ignored by the financial services industry today. And this has set the groundwork for making these areas vulnerable to predatory lending practices, including, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, excessive interest rates and excessive closing costs on the type of housing that Native Americans are relying upon. Next slide, please. In this map, it shows some of the areas we'll be talking about today of Arizona and New Mexico. These areas are the tribal areas, the reservations of the two states. In the center, you see this very large area, the Navajo Nation, and in that area in orange, the Hopi Reservation. This is an area that's as large as the state of West Virginia. So these are considerable portions of these two states that are tribal lands. On the topic of home ownership, well, there's a tremendous home ownership gap between Native Americans and non-Hispanic whites. In New Mexico, that's a 10% gap. In Arizona, a 16% gap in home ownership. Next, Jason. Additionally, Native American housing on a national level suffers from inadequate plumbing and access to fresh water. 6% of Native American homes. Next. Inadequate heating. 12% of Native American homes have inadequate heating within their structures. And next. And situations of overcrowding, where 16% of Native American households suffer from overcrowding. So these types of problems are much more severe for Native American housing. Next slide, Jason. Now this extends over into the area also of socioeconomic disadvantage, incomes, and social status. Here we have a map showing concentrated disadvantage, and those areas that are in dark brown, those are the areas of the greatest concentrated disadvantage, which is almost all of the tribal areas within the two states. These are areas of very high poverty, unemployment, and reliance on public assistance. Next. And this has very real effects in terms of life expectancy. Native Americans as a group have the lowest life expectancy of any racial group in the United States. It was 71.8 years in 2019. During the pandemic, this slipped to 67.9 years. This is 7 years lower than for non-Hispanic white Americans. So these impacts have very real costs in terms of life expectancy for Native American people. Next slide. Now, in writing this report and doing this analysis, we confronted some problems with the data, one of which is the census data. It's had problems with doing adequate counts of Native Americans, particularly in tribal areas, because of the remoteness and also because of the low number of Native Americans in many areas. However, we found another problem where between 2010 and 2020, the number of people identifying as Native American almost doubled in the United States, going from 5.2 million to 9.7 million. So this type of change in self-identification really impacts the overall socioeconomic status, the statistics we have on that. Another problem we had was the poor data coverage in tribal areas. They often lacked full data on housing in these areas. And then there was a mismatch with our mortgage lending data and small business data and census tracts. So what we had to do is we had to develop a way of looking at the tribal areas and then assessing those areas which were 100% tribal areas so that we can then use that data. So throughout the report, these are referred to as tribal lands. Next slide. One mode of analysis which we utilized on this was calculating a financial needs index. And this index, it looks at density of population, access to transportation, cell phones, internet, and also the distance to bank branches. And you can see in the two states of Arizona and New Mexico that access is problematic in all rural areas, but it's even worse in the tribal areas. Next slide. And this map shows this financial needs index with bank branch locations on top of it. And this analysis, it showed that, for instance, the Navajo Nation, that area that's the size of West Virginia, 250,000 people live there. And they have 5 total bank branches serving that population and serving that area. So there's grave need for greater financial access and services within the tribal areas. Next slide. So after the financial needs index, we also looked at small business lending in tribal areas between the period of 2018 and 2021. Now, this is a comparison between low to moderate income areas within the two states. And what we found is that less than 1 cent for every dollar loaned in other low to moderate income areas went to tribal areas. And that over the 4 years, there was an average of only 5 loans in tribal lands compared to 82 in other low to moderate income areas within the two states. Next slide. Now, one thing that occurred during the pandemic was the Paycheck Protection Program, and this took up a lot of the small business lending across the country during that time period. We did an analysis of the Paycheck Protection Program lending. What we found is that this provided a lifeline to Native American communities, that many workers in casinos, restaurants, hotels, but also in essential services like tribal government administration and also the Navajo Electric Company. They were highly reliant on the Paycheck Protection Program to support jobs and continue jobs during that time period. We also found there were very low, if any, rates of fraud in the PPP program in Arizona and New Mexico in the tribal lands. Next slide. Now, when we come to mortgage lending, the preeminent program to support mortgage lending is the HUD Section 184 Guaranteed Mortgage. And this is federal backing for mortgages to Native American borrowers. This program, as you can see from the slide here, it started back in the mid-1990s, and it got off to a very slow start. There wasn't much lending up until about 2004. Now, that lower line there, that's the amount of lending that's taking place on tribal lands or tribal trust areas. There have been problems with that lending, and as you can see, only 204 loans were made in 2018, and this is across the country in tribal trust areas. So this is a grossly inadequate meeting of the needs of Native American borrowers for the housing structure within tribal areas. Part of the problems with this are, well, the tribal trust areas, it's in the nature of ownership of the land. These are areas that are set aside by the federal government as trust areas. So they're jointly administered by the tribal governments and by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this adds to some of the administrative complexity in making these loans. Additionally, the lending there, because the land can't be owned outright, it involves long-term leases, often 100-year leases being made on this land, which can be quite complex. Now, to talk a little bit more about this issue of mortgage lending and also about lending for manufactured homes, Jason Richardson, our Director of Research, will talk about that.
Thanks, Bruce. So first of all, let's look across the top 10 metros in the study area. And we wanted to take a look and kind of get an idea of how important the Native population was across the entire study area. And we looked at loans using the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and we identified loan applications where a Native American applicant or co-applicant was present. Out of about 2.6 million loans across the entire area between 2018 and 2021, we counted about 48,000 with a Native applicant or co-applicant. Numerically, they're concentrated in Phoenix. However, they're a very small part of the overall Phoenix market. Farmington and Gallup in New Mexico were the two metros where they made up a much larger share of the mortgage market. Another thing we quickly found was a very different type of lending going on tribal lands as opposed to off tribal lands. Off tribal lands, manufactured housing is a relatively small part of the market, making up just 4% of home purchase loans during the study period in the two states. However, on tribal land, that was about half of all home purchase loans were for a manufactured home. The cost of these loans varies too, based on what kind of housing it is. So if the borrower is Native and if they're on tribal land, loans are priced in something called basis points. And you can see that non-natives buying a manufactured home off tribal land pay about 149 basis points more than the national average mortgage rate for that day that the loan closes. However, Native borrowers on tribal land buying a manufactured home pay 549 basis points on average. What does that mean? So recently, the average mortgage rate across the country was 6.77%. What these numbers all mean is that off tribal land, a non-native buyer of a manufactured home would get about 8.2% as their interest rate. Meanwhile, a native buyer on tribal land buying a manufactured home is paying 12.26%. Over 20 years, we're talking about $64,000 in additional interest the native buyer will pay for taking a $100,000 loan in comparison to a non-native buyer off tribal land. Now, one key difference in lending on versus off tribal land is that borrowers, and Bruce mentioned this, borrowers on tribal land rarely can borrow against the land itself. They can only borrow against the manufactured home. Generally, these homes are going to depreciate over time, so it puts the native borrower on tribal land in a quandary where they're paying more for a depreciating asset and they're not able to encumber the land with the loan, nor do they have fee simple ownership of that property. That's just an example really of how this mortgage system we have in the country is poorly suited to serving this population on tribal land. So there's only a few lenders really doing manufactured home lending on tribal land. Two of them, Vanderbilt Mortgage and 21st Mortgage, account for about 85% of all the home purchase loans on manufactured homes made during the study period. Both of these are subsidiaries of Berkshire Hathaway. So in summation, we found Native Americans are being walled out of the traditional mortgage market. Half of home purchase loans on tribal lands are for manufactured homes. Tribal lands receive very little small business investment, and they have a much higher degree of financial need than the rest of the country or the rest of rural areas. Okay, with that, I'm going to ask Dave Castillo to take over and give us a lot more detail. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. So these are the 5 policy recommendations in the report, and I'm going to go through each one with some additional commentary. Next slide. Okay, so first I'd like to do some level setting because I think many of the issues that affect access to capital in Indian country are due to a difference in viewpoint, not necessarily bad, but different. And we together must decide how to address and reconcile these differences. Some of those differences are noted on the left. The graphic illustrates the question: how does home ownership for Indian country sit in between and betwixt these two worlds in which we coexist? With regard to the value of homeownership in Indian country, it is unique from what many on this webinar might consider. On tribal lands, homes are not typically thought of simply as a bunch of sticks and bricks formed into an asset with an appreciating monetary value. Rather, a home is not so much a structure, but a place where we teach our children, hold ceremonies and celebrations, and nurture our families. Few, if any, in Indian country build a home to flip it and move to, let's say, Florida. Home is a specific place that in many cases are considered places of origin, places given to a specific people by the Creator. This is where life began and where it has continued for generations of our respective families and communities, and where, for a lack of access to capital, we are unable to maintain shelter from the elements. So I realize this is a bigger topic than we have time to discuss today, so let it serve simply as a backdrop for the comments. The first recommendation on your screen, next slide. This recommendation, it's not shameless self-promotion. It's a reflection of the dedication of Native CDFIs and our allies to do the hard work needed to build tribal economies. Ideally, when a Herculean effort is needed, a grand plan is devised, but there doesn't seem to be the political will to offer tribes something like the Marshall Plan after World War II. Instead, after the Indian Wars, tribes have had to get by with paternalism and poverty programs. Next slide. Nevertheless, what George Floyd and the pandemic revealed is at least an acknowledgement that the colonial era left a legacy that demands a response. And the work that tribes and Native CDFIs do in this space is part of our response. And for those unfamiliar with tribal lands in the Southwest, I think this is just another map, and it shows a significant land area that tribes make up. In Arizona alone, it's 27% of the land base. Next slide. And so that work that I was talking about, it's that much more impressive because the various financial tools available to build non-Indian communities have long been withheld for use in Indian country. These are some of the homes we've helped build nonetheless. Next slide. But Native CDFIs across the country are adapting existing tools. You can see the LTV on this project is spectacular by even the most conservative credit standards. Next slide. The work also involves partnering with allies to forge new financial tools to rebuild tribal economies. These are some of the small businesses we've helped support or get established. Next slide. All of that work has been resulting in the building of an ecosystem of support for, in our case, aspiring homeowners on tribal lands and Native entrepreneurs. It's complex work, but one that is ours to do. I remember reminding a distraught colleague once that we're engaged in the process of nation rebuilding, that the U.S. colonialists would have rather have had us vanished, which is a euphemism for exterminated. What most of this, I think what most on this webinar may feel is a relic of history. Those of us doing this work know that since the Indian Wars, a low-profile economic warfare against tribes has continued. And so nation building under these conditions isn't supposed to be easy. but we're the ones to do that work together, I would say. And so we ask for you to join us in that necessary community and economic renewal. Next slide. The second recommendation references the 2001 and 2017 studies commissioned by the Department of Treasury. And those studies and the recommendations therein should be a signal that the paternalism ends here. Next slide. That the history is extremely well understood. Next slide. As well as potential prescriptions to remedy the economic legacy of U.S. Indian policy that historically was used as a weapon to attempt to dispossess tribes of, well, everything. Next slide. Yet progress and engagement is possible. Self-governance was taken from tribes during the Indian Wars, but sovereignty is a powerful concept at the heart of the Western ethos. And so Indian self-determination found renewed support over the last 50 years, and that is a stark rebuke to the paternalism that followed colonialism, and I think a tool that we can use going forward. Next slide, please. The policy recommendations, the data analysis, the current day data warriors and their allies at work on these issues, and those who implement the prescriptions are a vital part of the march towards economic justice and reconciliation, and to make it beautiful once again, which is a rough translation of what my Navajo in-laws say at the end of their prayers. Because in many ways, this vision of economic justice is, for us in the Native CDFI industry, our prayer. Next slide. The last three recommendations really get to the heart of the policy discussion at hand. And I was asked two questions regarding the report that I think are really important to bring forward. The first question was, why was this report necessary? And the second was, isn't the idea of having small, undercapitalized, nonprofit, Native-led CDFIs lead this effort asking too much? So with regard to the first question, the answer is that it is in no one's interest to have a significant portion of land and people within the US without economic potential. We all lose. And so this study was exceedingly necessary to set a baseline. With regard to the second question, that answer is a resounding yes. It is a massive effort, and we do need partners who will look to us to lead for our combined efforts to grow, both on the nonprofit, the tribal, and the private sector side, as well as the public sector. Because where we are today is that neither banks nor the GSEs, and even nonprofit, national, and regional intermediary lending organizations, none of them are serving tribes in a way that is compliant with the historic version of the CRA. Next slide. And neither are they conforming to the statutorily mandated requirements such as the duty to serve provisions within the HERA legislation. I often comment that with regard to tribes, the GSEs are engaged in a dereliction of their duty to serve. And so the fact is that we have arrived at this point. No one intended for Native CDFIs alone to, for example, develop a thriving mortgage market on tribal lands. However, if banks continue to redline tribal lands, opt instead to offer drops in the bucket with their grant making, while Native CDFIs attempt to boil the ocean with their limited resources, it's going to take a long time. And meanwhile, our relatives will continue to suffer the indignity of not being able to access capital or safe, decent, and affordable homes within extremely distressed local economies. Next slide. And there is much work yet to do. The timeline on this slide shows that since 1996, when I started my career, and when the idea of stimulating mortgage lending on tribal lands was new, since that time, there have been at least 4 major pieces of federal legislation necessary to better facilitate mortgage lending and community development on tribal trust lands. That's not to mention several congressionally mandated studies and regulatory reform. Next slide. And so it is disheartening. Here we're talking about the 1071 rule around reporting on small business loans. And of course, we could bring into this discussion around, where the reform is out of CRA. But it's disheartening because despite the significance of our community's collective effort to address regulatory reform, Banks fought us at every step of the way. Through their lobbying efforts, banks are actively attempting to delay, weaken, or dismantle the policy foundation needed to improve access to capital on tribal lands and other underserved communities. Next slide. This report and others like it establish a baseline. The question is, will the CRA reform, the 2024 federal election cycle, our individual efforts at the community level to communicate the demand for access to capital in tribal communities, will any of that affect the concentrated disadvantage in tribal communities? Next slide. So maybe with regard to CRA reform, maybe we need to collectively hold our breaths until this election year is over. If we get another Biden administration, those banks who are lining up on the wrong side of this issue by calling for weakening reform, well, we'll be coming for you. I'm just joking. Sorry. I had to get that one in. Seriously, though, we're coming to you in a sense of partnership. Next slide. So please read the report and engage us in the solutions we so desperately need. We and our Native CDFI colleagues around the country need investment capital that banks can readily supply. I will remind you that the history of underinvestment or outright fraud and abuse demands concessionary rates justified by what are regulatory goals-rich benefits to banks. Indian country and Native CDFIs are a good investment. We're simply asking you to be a part of a success story that we could write together. Next slide. If you are still unsure about where your institution may be on the question of investing in Indian country, consider the rest of this graphic. It posits two individuals from different backgrounds. Are they displaying a stoic, committed resolve to the work ahead? Or are they fearful and suspicious of each other and the outcomes? Consider a Rorschach test and decide for yourself which version you will be. As for myself, I'm the former, and then I invite others of like mind to a specific discussion about the investment opportunities available. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Dave, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. With this, I think Katie's going to take over and lead us through our Q&A. There's already a few questions there. Katie?
Yep. And the first one I'll just say at the top, and we'll write this in there as well, that we will share the recording and the slides for this. So if you feel like that was a lot of information to take in all at once, don't worry, we've got you covered. And I'm going to ask a colleague to go ahead and reshare the link to the actual report for reference. There were a couple of questions that we answered during the presentations that we felt like were worth circling back to. And actually, if we could go all the way back, I don't remember what slide number it was, but all the way back to the HUD section 184 slide. There was a question about what a blue line meant that was actually more involved than I originally thought it was. And so I'd love for Bruce to be able to elaborate on that a little bit.
Hold on one second. I'll reshare. Oops.
Yeah, sure, Katie. And I'll just start in here until we pull that slide up. That was that line graph showing the Section 184 home lending. And tribal areas and Native American lands, they have different forms of ownership of the land. In this case, that top line shows these areas that are fee simple ownership. And these are areas in which a Native American can actually hold title to the land. And you can see that lending there is much greater, where they can hold title to the land. These areas, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dave, these areas really are largely outside of the study area. We're looking at Arizona and Mexico. I think it typifies land ownership maybe in areas like Oklahoma.
No, so that's part of it, right? So what we know about the Section 184 program is that banks gravitated to where it was easiest to do deals. And the law allows for loans to Native Americans anywhere. So banks went to, there's plenty of folks in Phoenix, Denver, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles who are Native American who were able to benefit from the 184 program. And also Southeast Alaska and Oklahoma, where the lands are not, have a different status other than trust land. So that's what that number represents. It's basically where the money is needed least. Or I should say that banks are not serving the areas that are where the mortgages are needed most, which is on tribal trust lands, on Indian reservations, and the rest of the lower 48, excluding Southeast Alaska and Oklahoma. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
And just to say it one more time, the appendix of the report actually has, if you want to read some more about that, the appendix of the report is a good place to look. And then we also had a question about how we define concentrated disadvantage, and whether it's similar to the persistent poverty definition used in other contexts. So Bruce, if you could go ahead
Sure. Yeah.
and share that.
Yeah, good question, because we use the term and refer to concentrated disadvantage quite a few times in the report. And basically, this is a metric, and it looks at levels of poverty, levels of unemployment, numbers of families, percentage of families on public assistance, also of single parent families and children who are living in these areas. And it's a combination of those factors that come together in an index. It's widely used in public health research, and that's why we used it for this report. It differs a little bit from the other index you were talking about there. So yeah, and the definition again of that is in the report. You can see how that was calculated and what our results are on that.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to turn it over in just a minute to Jason to answer a couple more questions, but I just wanted to call out Lydia Guzman had a great comment that I just feel like gets to some of the heart of what we're talking about here. Just noting that this makes it incredibly hard for Native communities to build and pass on generational wealth. And I just felt like that comment was worth lifting up. You guys, we're going through the data on this, that we're talking about whole families being impacted generation to generation. So thank you, Lydia, for calling that out. And Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about manufactured home loans,
Yep.
how that information is accounted for,
Yeah.
and yeah.
So that was a good question, and this is a really kind of a technical dive into Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. Manufactured home loans are collected. They also collect data now on whether or not the loan includes the land underneath the property and how the property is titled. So yeah, it does have more information in the raw data. And anonymous attendee, if you have any more questions on that, please let me know. I'm happy to take a deeper look or help you with the data if you want to take a look at it yourself. Joanne Baker, you asked the name of the companies that do manufactured home loans. In the report, we do have a list of the top lenders. There's only two there that you really need to care about. And that's the 21st Mortgage and actually I forgot the other one's name. Also Vanderbilt Mortgage. They were 85% of all home loans on tribal land in the 3-year period or 4-year period we looked at. Both of those are owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Caroline Dunleavy asked, how can those of us who advocate on redlining in the older northeastern cities work for you? Work with you. Contact Greg Wilson, senior organizer at NCRC, and he can talk to you more about how we work with members, how we build coalitions, and how we're working with Dave and other partners in tribal areas. Bernina Gray, we would insist you cite the report. And if you have questions about how to cite it, it looks like Bruce is typing an answer. You can always reach out to Bruce Mitchell and we can help you figure that. There we go. Perfect. Let's see. Go ahead.
I was going to suggest there's a great question about whether there are online banks serving Native communities or majority Native areas. I don't know if any of y'all have a good answer on that one.
So there are 19 tribal-owned banks, but they many of them operate like a tribal enterprise would. But there are, I mean, Native CDFIs are typically not depository institutions. We typically do work online. There is something called Totem, which is a new type of a banking institution. So I think the thing to say here is, as I've kind of try to relay in my presentation is we're building the ecosystem that's needed to serve tribes and tribal members living on tribal trust lands, because we've just have what is, I think, rightly an abject market failure that banks have decided not to serve tribal members. Instead, we have lenders of last resort, which are predatory lenders. We have just a saturation of predatory lenders serving the capital needs of tribal members, and that's not the kind of money we need. We need banks to step forward and show some leadership and invest in this space. We need native CDFIs to grow and do more. We need, again, a whole ecosystem of support around this issue, and we're building it now. Someone from NCRC reminded me the words of a modern day philosopher who say, the hungry don't stay hungry long, right? We will find a way. And that's what we're doing. And we need your help. We need the bank's help. We need the regulators' help. We need community members speaking out. There was a question on here about how do you access support from your local chapter or your tribal district. So we need you to speak with your tribal leadership and make sure they're informed on these topics. And everyone here on this webinar is happy to be a part of that through this study and through local advocacy efforts. Thanks.
Great.
Hey guys,
Um,
a lot of folks are asking for Dave Castillo's email in the chat. Can we post that?
Yep.
Sure.
Yep. And then Bruce, I believe you wanted to answer this question about a proposed rule around the HUD 184 program. Yeah, I'll let you frame that up. I'll read the question out loud. The HUD 184 program is going under a proposed rulemaking. Is NCRC participating in that? Currently, the online HMDA data does not provide HUD 184 data. So where and how did NCRC get data? Ooh.
Yeah, Section 184 data. We could not get that data. We actually filed a FOIA request, and if someone from HUD is on the line, we would love to get that data so that we can have access and, write a intelligent comment for the Section 184 ruling on that. But we had to rely upon prior HUD reports to get that data, and it only covered up to, 2018. So we'd love to get more recent data on that. Thank you.
Yeah. I also saw a question about what folks can do. That it seems like voting with your dollars can be hard because alternative financial institutions, co-ops, CDFIs struggle to get to scale. I have some CRA answers in my mind, but Dave, as a CDFI guy, do you want to take this one?
So the question was, what can individuals do, like moving their money and things of that
What
nature?
can we do to change this? What can we do to shift these realities? Yeah.
Well, there's a few different levels, right? I mean, if you're talking at the bank level, move the money, folks, right? Like make the investment. That's really kind of the message here. If we're talking about regulators and congressional folks, uh, as I've said before and others have said before, laws are only as strong as their enforcement. So if enforcement actions are needed, I mean, that's a question. Why would a bank like, suffer a fine or a class action lawsuit by avoiding complying with the law? Just comply with the law, right? You have the resources, you have the people out there, there is a demand, and we're here to kind of work together. If we're talking about kind of the average Joe or maybe someone within an institution, I can't tell you how many times doors have been opened for me, right? There was someone at a big bank who I think had been there for a long time, and they saw what was going on at the bank, and they had done okay for themselves, but it was clear that that individual's family and that individual's community had not done well. And so it kind of winked to me and said, hey, I'm opening a door for you, walk through and do what you do, because I've done what I can on this side of the bank. So it takes all of us. I think for the average Joe, I think, if you're at the community level, talk to your community leadership. There's a lot of information. This report is just part of it. If you're in another part of the country, I saw something about the Northeast or Northwest or the Great Plains or the Great Lakes region, commission a study and do this same type of work for your area. What do your numbers show? because information is power. I used to someone said, in business, cash is king. But in our work, data is queen, right? It's more powerful. It can move farther across the board, and it can be very impactful. So get the data, use the data, and make your case for what's needed in your community.
Yeah. In a similar vein, there's a specifically CRA related question here. Are banks not required to abide by CRA requirements in these areas? Are there special rules in native lands? And there's going to be a before and after and TBD version of this answer. So I'll let you give that.
So it's a big question, and I've been doing this work my entire career. Um, you know, uh, and I know Jason and I have had different opinion on this thing, because from a business side, I mean, I'm sure a bank would just say, look, we're not a charity organization, right? If there's business to be had there, we'll be there, right? But we're not gonna bend over backwards to try to do something that doesn't generate shareholder value. Um, and that's a way of thinking that it's kind of become normalized, right? I mean, Warren Buffett, for goodness sakes, is been lionized, and yet he's the king of predatory lending, as it turns out, in Arizona and New Mexico. So which one is it? Do we value kind of what Warren Buffett's banks are doing, or do we value the communities and what they need? It's a shift that has happened gradually over time, where corporations really look to increase shareholder value instead of support stakeholders, which are all of us. So, yeah, CRA, that's why the reform was necessary. That's why tribal land areas have been included in the new CRA, because banks simply were not motivated or able to serve tribes, and now they can. So this is kind of the starting point. This is the baseline data that tells us where we're at, and the question is, where are we going to be a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Will the CRA reform have its intended effect, or will banks have their way in the courts and delay implementation of CRA, meaning that the numbers will stay the same? I hope that we get to the point where really CRA reform is something that's used as a tool, and we could come together and build tribal economies and do a better job, all of us.
Hey, real quick, Dave, isn't it true the assessment area component in the CRA reform does open up new opportunities now for investing in Indian country? And if I can go back one question, people ask, what can they do? They can join NCRC. We have a coalition in New Mexico right now that's bringing together Anglo, African American, Latino, and Native American folks, and we'll probably build one out in Arizona as well. But Dave, I was curious about your view of the assessment rule or the assessment area changes to the rule change.
Yeah, I mean, it presents tremendous opportunities, but only if you take hold of it, right? If you decide that, as a banker once told me, why would I go through the brain damage of figuring out how to do a deal in Indian country when I could get what I need from the OCC by lending to African Americans in Southside Chicago or Hispanics in Eastside LA, right? Well, you're not quite there yet, right? If it's too much brain damage for you, I say this. I say you could lead, you could follow, or you can get out of the way, right? If you lead, what does that mean? Leading means that you put a budget together, you hire natives, you develop financial products, and you set production goals, right? That means that you're going to go after the business, you're going to get the business, and you're going to grow the business. That's leading, and that's what we need banks to do. If the bank is not going to lead, then they should follow, right? They say, this is too much for us. We're going to invest in organizations that are almost exclusively focused on serving Native Americans on tribal trust lands, or exclusively focused, and we're going to follow their lead. And if you're not going to do either of those, well, then get out of the way, right? And stop promoting, don't put up Black Lives Matter and, honor Native American Peoples Day, because you're not honoring it, right? By not investing this. If you're going to honor that day and the people, then make the investment.
This is a great segue for our next couple of questions. I'm going to group these together. With that framework, who is leading? Who's leading the way? And I'm seeing that question both what banks are leading, who's doing well, and then also on the policy side, are there any specific House reps or senators that we're seeing some traction and some leadership from in these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, here in Arizona and New Mexico, we have strong delegation. Certainly the Biden administration has been making good progress. I mean, even the federal agencies like USDA Rural Development, right? We've got the HUD 184, but USDA has just been tremendous in terms of rural development, piloting some new initiatives through special legislation. Also, on the congressional side, there's some movement to create a new homeowner down payment program nationally that would also serve tribes. Let's see, on the business front, or I should say the nonprofit front. I mean, there are Native CDFIs all over the country, native and non-native, who have really innovative approaches. And there are more new ideas coming. So you don't have to look any farther. Plug into the network that exists. On the private sector side and the banking side, like I said, I mean, folks in the compliance community on the CRA side, they are some of those people who are from our communities. They do understand, but it's really hard to, and I was at the bank myself, right? I used to be the person that would pound my fist on the table when I worked on the advocacy side for tribes. But once I got to the bank, I mean, I knew who was signing my paycheck. But you still got to try to advocate. So there are partners and allies everywhere. NCRC, again, great on the research side and the advocacy side. I would definitely support membership there. The allies and the folks doing good work. Southwest Native Assets Coalition I saw was listed there. They're doing small dollar debt consolidation lending in New Mexico and Arizona. I mean, we're building the ecosystem. So there is a lot of success stories out there. I think what this report shows is how much farther we need to go.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. And I'm looking to try to prioritize really quick because there's too many good ones. Why don't we do this? Because panelists can see this too. Can we do a lightning round? Each of y'all take one last question that you want to answer. Yeah, crack those knuckles, Jason. And 60-second answers.
Dave, are you familiar or already working with the OWISTA Corporation? There's one that
Yeah, there's a few national groups out there. That's one out of Colorado, I think. There's a National Association of Native CDFIs. And there are regional groups as well, whether it's the Southern California Tribal Chairman's Association, Intertribal Council of Arizona. There are intertribal organizations. One that I will mention that I think deserves a lot of consideration for doing new, interesting, and exciting things is the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians and the AT&I Economic Development Corporation. On the small business lending side, they are way out ahead. So there are some really good tribal organizations, native-led, that are innovating on these issues. And I'd really suggest whatever region you're in, you look up who's in your region, and we all know each other. So we're just like 2 degrees of separation from each other anyway. Thanks.
I see one that I'll take. Rebecca Saunders asked, can you talk about success stories, areas of positive change? And yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and say that you guys are hearing that ringing, right? That's my teenager calling me. Hold on a second. Let me just mute this. Oh my goodness. So we're professional, I promise. Yeah, I tell you what's positive for me is the growth in data that we're seeing. HMDA data has gotten better over the last few years and does a much better job of letting us pull out Native American borrowers in a variety of ways. And Section 1071 data is coming up as well in a couple of years. So that'll be really interesting.
All right, one last question. Bruce, you want to pick one?
I see some controversy in the chat just about the use of the term Indian country.
Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah, let me just clarify that a little bit. This is a formal term that the federal government utilizes. It's in federal regulations, the EPA, executive orders. So we're using a formal term that's utilized by the federal government to define these areas.
Yeah,
Hey,
Thanks.
Greg, you said something about a question
Yeah,
in the chat.
there was a gentleman from the source, New Mexico, who asked about the checkerboard.
Oh, checkerboard. Yeah, so checkerboard means land fractionation, which it's kind of complicated. But the reason and the way that the analysis was done was to take into consideration, households that are Native American versus or areas that were primarily Native American, and then all the way there was like 4 gradations. So the checkerboard areas are an interesting relic of colonialism and expansion, and the analysis took that into consideration for sure. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. Dave, we particularly appreciate your partnership in this report. Jason, Bruce, the work that y'all do to make sure that data drives the movement for economic justice is just incredible. And the work that then the rest of all of us on this webinar are able to do because of that data is just incredibly important. And finally, Greg, you have cheerleaded this effort for a long time. And yeah, just really grateful for you working to make sure that we all follow directions and keep moving forward. So, and thank you to our attendees. Once again, we'll share the slides and the recording of this. Please be on the lookout for that soon, and fill out a survey so that we are able to continue to improve our content and make sure that it meets your needs. Thanks again. Have a good one.